Here. Awesome. We are recording for those who can't make it today. So this is a joint session supported by the ISHE Research to Action Fellows Program and the USC Children's Center Be Heard Seminar Series. We're really excited to have you all today. I think one of our speakers or one of our guests is having an issue joining, but hopefully is able to join us in just a second. But today we do have here with us right now Dr. David González, who is a new colleague of mine and an assistant professor in the Division of Environmental Health Sciences at UC Berkeley. And hopefully shortly we'll be joined by Dr. Bhavna Shamasunder, who's an associate professor in urban and environmental policy at Occidental College. So Doctors González and Shamasunder are really leaders in environmental health and justice. And I think we are really fortunate to have the opportunity to hear from them today regarding their experiences and writing commentaries. So I'm going to give Dr. González a few minutes to kind of introduce himself and his work in this space. And then this is really primarily going to be an interactive and discussion-based session where you'll really have an opportunity to ask questions and have a little bit of interaction back and forth. And so if possible, I really encourage you to have your cameras on and be prepared to engage in a fruitful discussion. So I will now turn it over to Dr. González.
Well, good morning, or I don't know if you have any East Coasters. Good afternoon. I'm David González. Very excited to be here with you all today. And I see that Bhavna is now joining us as well. So I'll just give myself, I'll just introduce myself briefly and pass it over to my co-presenter.
I'm hearing echo. Oh, I think there we go. Awesome. All right, go ahead, David.
Great. What should I say? I'm an environmental health scientist. I have an interdisciplinary background, trained in all kinds of different things, environmental science, epidemiology, environmental justice. But what really keeps me going is trying to work on developing evidence to support policy interventions to improve public health. So basically using the tools that we need to answer the questions that need to be answered to make that happen. So I've been working on several issues lately, primarily in the past several years now, the issue of oil and gas development in California and how that impacts health. I got into this because I grew up in a neighborhood or a community, not my neighborhood directly, but community with an oil refinery next to couple oil fields, and happened to be the site of the largest oil spill in the state of California, out in the Guadalupe and Pomo Dunes, Southern California. 12 million gallons of diluent, which is a low density fuel, were spilled into some coastal dunes next to the town of Guadalupe and the town of Pomo, where I'm from, over the course of 40 years. And the company managing it was aware of that for half the time and did not take protective action. That's a kind of experience that motivated me to get into this field and say, like, why why is this allowed to happen? Why is this particularly happening around communities of color, predominantly Latinx communities in that case? And what are the public health tools, like scientific tools, that we can apply to try to start answering questions that matter to communities? So one thing, with that spill, growing up in that area, I think we still don't really know how that impacts health, especially for folks that were going out fishing in the waters off of this massive spill, which many of my neighbors did. And the other issue I've been working on, and I know Dr. Shamasunder has been working on as well, is this issue of oil drilling and producing oil and gas in residential areas. We've done that in California for over 100 years because the oil industry grew up alongside, the rapid development of California, particularly in parts of Los Angeles. And that's a legacy that's left us with, in the modern day, many oil fields in places where people live, work, and go to school. And the city of Los Angeles is now a city with more urban oil and gas production than any city in the US. So that's another thing, another perspective I bring is, the way that we often talk and think about my home state of California as an environmental beacon, but we're not without issues. That's one of them. We also have some of the most polluted cities in the US and some of the widest health disparities within those cities. So we have some real issues here, and it connects to global issues as well, obviously, like climate and other parts of the US and the world where oil and gas production happen and impacts people's health in the short term and obviously in the long term through legacy impacts from oil and gas wells that have been retired, and of course the impacts of climate change. So big introduction. Then the kind of research that I do, epidemiological studies. I'm trying to understand how living near oil and gas wells impacts birth outcomes and maternal health outcomes. Also studying climate and the pathways by which that happens. And then a major focus of mine is understanding disparities and the underlying causes of those disparities. So if we see certain communities seem to have more heavier burden from environmental hazards, documenting that, but then asking deeper questions. Why did that come to be? What are the policy mechanisms that led to that? And ultimately, what are the policy interventions that we can scale up to mitigate those disparities? So, and that kind of ties into what I think about with respect to commentaries, and I'll wrap this up and then excited to get to questions in a little bit. But what is the field doing, and what do we think that the field can do better? I'm one researcher, but we have a lot of researchers out there across all these different institutions, and I think collectively we have a lot of power. But I think that commentaries give us a venue to introduce new ideas from maybe other disciplines or new ways of thinking, or challenging maybe some patterns of thought that maybe aren't serving us anymore. So one area I've been doing that in is trying to make sure that we're co-publishing our research in Spanish so that colleagues in Spanish-speaking countries and other parts of the world in the US can have access to our information, and as well as the communities and their policymakers. So that's a commentary that we published earlier this year in Environmental Health Perspectives, the importance of moving towards linguistic inclusion in the environmental health sciences. And I'm following up on that with some additional commentaries, and then doing other work as well. So happy to get into any of this stuff. And I also recognize we have a lot of expertise in the room. So if folks have additional perspectives to share, or thoughts, or thought-provoking questions, I'm really looking forward to our discussion today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. And then, welcome, Dr. Shamasunder. If you want to just give a little intro to yourself, and then we'll get into questions.
Yeah, thank you, Carly and David, for putting this together. I could call you Dr. Hyland and Dr. Gonzales. But it's really nice to see everyone. My work computer broke right before I got here, and it's not connecting to the internet. So I'm now on my family's computer. So if I have issues, just let me know. But I am at Occidental College. It's a small liberal arts college in Los Angeles. And so it's, I spend a lot of my time teaching undergraduate students and something I'm really invested in is how to teach the next generation of scholars about research and environmental justice research in particular. So that's kind of just where I'm positioned. I'm in a policy department. I teach in urban and environmental policy. And also I chair the public health minor of our school. So one of the things that is maybe notable about my career is I've been trained in, and I've always worked in an interdisciplinary department. And so I got my master's at the Yale School of the Environment, and then I got my PhD at the Environmental Science Policy and Management department, not too far from where David is. And then I've been teaching in UEP since I got my PhD. So I really think I would situate myself as kind of an interdisciplinary environmental justice scholar. And I am very maybe promiscuous about my methods, because I have the benefit of not being kind of in a narrow disciplinary space. So I work with lots of folks, probably some of the folks on this call. I work a lot with Jill Johnston at USC. I work with Ami Zota at Columbia. I work with Silent Spring Institute in Massachusetts and Black Women for Wellness. So really the ways in which I answer my questions are ones that I think are the ones that are gonna, the method that's going to answer the question, and the community partner that is most kind of situated. My work is all community-based research, is situated, the community organizations that's positioned kind of in the community and centered on the issue. Most of my questions come from real world challenges that communities are facing. And then we see kind of the effort to how do we do this work. And sometimes community questions are not answerable through research. They're really kind of moral and ethical questions that are not research questions. And I think parsing out which is what is a really important thing to try to start to do as a scholar. What can you answer? And then what can the things that are answerable, how do you do that in a way that is most benefits? I think what David mentioned is how do you support policy change? And we work in a world in which a lot of policies that have been passed historically are systemically racist or did not actually created the conditions of environmental injustice, right? So how do you start to unravel that is one of the things that we try to do. So my big projects currently, I really would say that I work on kind of any issue that's at the front line of industrial pollution in an urban area. I work on currently a lot of oil and gas drilling in Los Angeles. And as David mentioned, LA is one of the largest urban oil fields in the country. It's been drilling for a long time, and oil fields are right next to neighbors. And so there's been a decade-long campaign to get oil drilling out of the neighborhoods. And doing that work is in partnership with residents. So I work on this primarily with Dr. Johnston. And one of the things that we've thought a lot about is how do you do results communication in a pretty complicated research space? And I think that is a good question here. Like, how do you do that? And the other big project I work on is consumer product exposures to women of color. So I'm interested in the questions of cumulative burden and how women of color in particular, but communities of color, what are the products that people are purchasing in urban, in these already burdened neighborhoods, and do consumer products add to the burden of pollution that people are exposed to, or do they add to their exposures? And so I will put in the chat, I don't know if I can do that, but there, one of the ways in which we do this. So I'll just, to talk about commentaries, I'll say three things. One is that I think all researchers should translate, even if you don't work in partnership with a resident or a community or a frontline community, translate your research into something other people can understand. I feel like we live in a world where most people, we're okay and comfortable with most people not understanding what we do. Like doing, most people don't even understand our jobs. Like, what do you do? Like, how do you do that? Why is your job so flexible? You don't work 9 to 5, right? So our jobs itself are kind of a weird thing, but translating our work, even things that are not community-based, is, I think, really important. The second is that sometimes we work in partnership with, and doing that through commentaries and kind of in academic journals, but in non-academic journals and in newspapers. The second is figuring out in partnership with your community partner what output would be the most useful. And sometimes that's a community meeting. It may not even be a commentary, but sometimes it's a community meeting and then you explain results in a community forum. But you also write something. You can write, an op-ed, you can write a blog post. It could be, you could write, a message that goes out to their membership about the research. And then the third is writing for a community. So writing, like, if there is, and David and I have talked about this, but you sometimes are asked to support an op-ed or something, that just to make sure the data is right that's going out in the community. So you do you're a ghostwriter, like you don't appear at all in the public facing thing. Your name doesn't appear, but you sort of you fact checked it, made sure it was correct, and made sure that the voice that's being presented is a community voice. And maybe that goes in like the LA Times or something. So those are the kinds of ways in which I've done kind of public communications and commentaries in the past, but I think I'll just stop there and maybe, and I put an example in the chat of some of the ways that we make infographics, but and open it up for questions.
Awesome.
Awesome.
So much.
So much to.
I think
Bob
twice
advice with the.
Say it one more time.
I hear an echo. Are you?
Oh, here, I'll mute myself. It must be my terrible microphone.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. So I will kick us off with a question. And one of the things I'm really curious about is kind of the impact you've seen, not so much for your own, scholarly impact, but impact with communities and kind of impact in moving the needle forward. One of the reasons we're all here is because we're interested in that process of translation to policy and making sure that our findings aren't just getting out to other academic audiences, but really actually changing things for communities and programs and policies. So I'm curious if you can talk at all about, with different commentaries you've written, like, have you seen an impact, and has that seemed different than when you've just written, an article that's gone in a peer-reviewed journal for more of an academic audience?
I can start. I think something that I heard during my training that I found really beneficial is to think about a publication as a news event. And especially if it's like a high profile publication. And there's ways to leverage that. Again, I know probably folks in this room have published before and maybe had news coverage on your papers before. But if you in case you haven't, one thing you can do if you're going through the publication process and you think that you have a paper that's going to be of broader interest and maybe of interest to journalists is to work with a university communications office or press office. And I think I'm getting into the weeds before I meant to provide this bigger structure. There's different ways to leverage, I think, a publication to spread knowledge on a topic. And if you're working with news media, whether that's trying to, get media interest for like articles or interviews or podcasts around something, that can happen alongside writing your own stuff. Or sometimes you can only write your own stuff if news outlets aren't biting or aren't interested. So you can always take your put in the time to write something or to put something out into the world, a tool, a research brief, policy brief, an op-ed, a blog post, or social media work. You can always do that at any time. And if you are trying to get into broader audiences, you kind of need a news hook. And having a publication can be that news hook. So it's sort of like an artificial news hook, like, oh my goodness, new paper coming out from this research group, hot off the presses. This is, hey, news outlets, you want to cover this. You want to get on this new study. And guess what? I wrote this thing. So let's talk. That's not always the best strategy. That's why you work with your media office. They have relationships with reporters, so you can do the outreach directly. I think I'm straying a little bit from what the purpose of this question is, but you can kind of think about this as like a whole strategy. So one strategy is get in news outlets, and alongside that, write your own stuff. Is basically what I'm trying to say. In terms of impact, I think it's hard to measure. I think this would be my 2 cents. But I don't really think, I try to remind myself that what I do as a researcher is really not central to a lot of these discussions that are happening. I mean, by and large, if we're interested in pushing policies, that is often coming from highly organized political efforts, often from communities and advocacy organizations. For example, with the recent legislation to prevent drilling and add protections. So this is SB 1137, a bill that my work has contributed towards supporting. It wasn't scientists in the driver's seat there, but we needed the science there. And that's kind of how I view it, that we need to do high quality research, work alongside community partners and advocacy groups to get information out there. if you're doing community engaged research, obviously that's a different model, and you're working directly with communities. But for the research that I've been doing, it's been more of the secondary data analysis stuff, not directly working with communities for that body of work. So again, just to finish that thought, I think it's hard to measure the impact. I think to some extent, I'm less interested in measuring the impact than in providing the tools for people that are out there doing kind of all the advocacy. So making sure if we're writing about our research, we're writing about, we're writing about in a sophisticated way, we're trusting that our audiences can understand some of the nuance of these studies, provide the context for why we're doing it, and then make a case for how our research can be interpreted and applied in policy making settings. So, and then again, doing that in multiple languages. So we wrote an op-ed last year on this topic, published it in Environmental Health News in Spanish and in English, did the translation myself to make sure that it was like a quality one, and hopefully it's making an impact, but hard to tell.
Awesome. Thanks, David. And I just included a link to that in the chat. Bhavna, do you have anything to add?
Carly, when I speak and you're muted, am I still buzzing? No. Okay. Okay, thanks. The only thing I would add is that I agree with David. Like, I think making friends with, and people are in lots of different institutional contexts, but I think making friends with your media office is a really good step. Knowing who they are, and then anytime you have a paper, sending them a little press release of what, and help working with them on the press release. I will say that some offices are a lot better than others, like big R1s are better than Oxy. So I think my little school has been a little hard that strategy doesn't always work depending on where you are. But you could work, a lot of nonprofits have communication teams. And then the other thing is making friends with journalists directly. Like that, I think people who constantly cover, have a particular beat, they'll call you when they have a story. And I think a lot of us get calls whenever there's a story about a topic, and sort of keeping their numbers handy when you have a story or a paper, and making sure they know about it is really helpful. I think they do cover people. The news is always wanting content. And so your content could be, and knowing how you're going to frame the story. I think framing it for them is pretty important because sometimes they don't know what the point of this paper is, right? And so if you're not able to do that, then they'll do it themselves, and maybe you don't want that. So I guess that's one thing. And then the last thing is, I think that outlets like The Conversation are really helpful. A lot of people read that. I think a surprising number of people read that outlet. And so that, I think, and they have a really good team over there that edits your pieces. So I think that kind of an outlet would be good. And the other thing I think is a lot of people don't read our papers. And so we also write, and I'll put this in the chat, in partnership with other entities that are trying to tell a story. So this is a report that the Liberty Hill Foundation wrote in Los Angeles. They're a LA funder, and we have a chapter in there. But this report, every time there's a toxic tour or local politicians come to LA, they get a copy. It lives online, but we also have lots of hard copies. So it's not an academic piece, but it is robust in its storytelling and data. And so it kind of travels a line between the kinds of new media and peer-reviewed research, right? Like those are two kind of things that you want to publish in, but this is sort of a third option as well.
Awesome, thank you. I will open it up there for discussion if anybody has questions. It looks like maybe Emily, you have one if you want to unmute yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much, David and Bhavna, for joining us. I'm a doctoral student at Boston University. Bhavna actually has come to talk with our department in the past, so it's really exciting to be back here in a different context. My question, I'm a current doctoral student, and I know that many fellows here on the call span from student to postdoc to maybe assistant professor. And I was wondering if either of you might be able to comment on this question of mine, which is sort of, within the academic context, there is an emphasis put on, publishing peer-reviewed literature, and commentaries fall outside of this. And specific to this group, where maybe there are individuals who are feeling some pressure to publish more on the peer-reviewed side, what advice would you have for, I said early career researchers, but other researchers too, who maybe are prioritizing, primary research papers over commentaries or op-eds or some of these other forms of literature, which are really important in spreading that knowledge awareness, but maybe don't feel like they have the time or the capacity to prioritize those papers on top of the other pieces that are maybe holding more weight in their court right now.
That's a good question. And maybe I could start. I'm sure David has an advantage on this set. So I've been doing this kind of for a long time, and I started at a little school, and so I'm in a kind of a different context, although I do think that, so I sit on the tenure and promotion committee of my institution, and the conversation around community-based research is a really hard one. It's true that it's not valued, but it's becoming more valued. And so I think that's changing. I mean, all around the country, even in bigger institutions, it's changing. But I don't think it will replace a publication, right? So I think to do both, it does take a bit more work, which I think is helpful in trying to hone your writing. And maybe in the beginning of your career, you don't do it for everything. You don't write like a matching. Right now, every time we publish something, we try to publish a separate infographic or something that is public facing, but maybe you have to pick and choose a bit early in your career. But I do think that practicing that makes it easier. So if you're able to create, and especially creating the partnerships, spending a little time creating the partnerships on people who can help you, who are good at that. So there are lots of, community organizations that like have people already doing this. That's part of their job. Working with those kinds of groups makes it a little bit better. But I would say don't take it on all by yourself. Like, I don't think that's going to make your stress any better. And I don't think it'll build kind of the network you'll need in the future anyway. So I think being choosy and strategic and learning, maybe working with someone who already has tenure also is helpful, like who does this well, is another strategy.
I agree with everything Bhavna just said, and also that at Berkeley as well, an example of a larger institution, there is also a growing emphasis on different types of publishing, including different outputs you might have for a community partnered organization, so that there's growing recognition. It seems to be in multiple places for that, but I don't know by any means if that's a universal thing, but it seems to be growing in some places, and hopefully will continue to grow. Because, I mean, ultimately, peer-reviewed literature is a signal for our influence and our contributions to the scientific, field, but it's just one of many. And I think that try to remind myself, what is the purpose of all these different, essentially communications tools that we use? So one of our communications tools is publishing peer-reviewed literature, and that's to show that we've done a high-quality study that is worth other folks taking seriously, and hopefully, expanding new knowledge. Often we're trying to convey existing knowledge to different audiences that don't typically have it or have access to maybe the kind of information that we have access to as academics that are reading papers all the times and have institutional library access to journals. That's a different outlet. That's an important part of the job of, I think, being a scientist, at least for, you don't have to do it, but if for me, it's an important part of my job. So the privilege of being an academic I view it as part of my job. So I do it. And I've kind of always felt that way, even when I was a doctoral student, and even when senior advisors were telling me not to do it. And I would. I'm not saying that you shouldn't listen to your mentors, but your mentors may have a different view of what it means to be an academic than you do. And the nice thing about being an academic is you get to define yourself. So if you say, it's important for me to be doing science communication, and maybe that means that I'm going to publish a little bit less, but I'm going to have the kind of impact that I want to have, great. Or maybe you can do both, and maybe you've been underestimated for your capacity to do that. And I think that's not uncommon. I think it's not necessarily coming from a bad place. Mentors want to look out for you, want to protect your time, want to make sure you're setting your priorities, but they may not understand how committed you are to a topic and how much extra energy you have to commit to something that you care about. That's how I felt coming up. I listened to my instincts, and I did go a little bit, do things like community engaged stuff that I was advised against doing, diversity work that I was advised against doing, public outreach that I was advised against doing. And it turned out that that set me up for a career that I enjoy and to have a more broader base of stuff to talk about when I was on the job market. Like, hey, look, I've published this op-ed and I did in Spanish. Again, I keep saying that because we are not incentivized to publish in non-English languages either. That's work that I'm doing above and beyond the expectations, because it's important and it matters. And I don't care that no one is necessarily going to count it towards my tenure. It's the right thing to do. So I do it. And that's, to me, part of my model of change is like, okay, do the things that you need to do to be successful. And if you have the capacity, you can do more. And if you don't have the capacity, that's fine, because these jobs are hard. And that's where I think you team up with folks too. And you leverage communities like this op-ed that Carly dropped the link into the chat. We translated that to Spanish as a team. We had assembled a team with the right linguistic assets. So we had the people that could go in and do it, and then go and proofread it, and then talk to friends that are like, and family members that are native Spanish speakers, because we want to do a high quality job. So we figured it out, and other groups are doing similar things across the way. So I think that's the other point of who are we speaking to? We're speaking to our scientific colleagues when we're pushing the boundaries of knowledge with peer-reviewed literature. We're speaking to the public when we're doing op-eds and media work. And then the commentaries, the kind of ones that we write for each other, for colleagues, we're telling our colleagues, hey, this is a different way you can be in this space. You can center Spanish or other sorts of non-English languages in your work. Here's a way you can do it. And guess what? You're not the only ones doing it. So different messages for different audiences, but it's all in service of this greater goal, which is more inclusive, meaningful, diverse, representative research teams doing higher quality research that matters. That's ultimately in service of advancing public health, and guess what? That's my job. So whether I'm paid to do the little things or not, I'll do the things I need to do, and then you do the rest on top of it.
I think those were both really extraordinary answers, and I think some of the main things I took from that are like, you don't have to do it all right away, but starting to get some of this practice, and then hopefully over time that gets easier. And one thing I think also that is maybe a good lesson, a lot of us on this call are grad students or postdocs or assistant professors and kind of starting out, and like kind of working collectively to shift what we value in academia. And peer-reviewed publications are obviously important for, hopefully advancing policy, but also I think our generation seems to value and understand the importance a little bit more of some of these other types of science communication projects. And so as we're, ourselves getting on tenure and review committees and mentoring, fellows and mentees ourselves, kind of trying to shift that narrative a little bit, I think is really cool. Hafa?
Inspiring talk up to now. My name is Rafael Borali. I'm from University of São Paulo in Brazil. I'm doing my postdoc here, and I'm writing a commentary. It's my first one. It's not linked with a paper that I have published, but is a message that I would like to explore, not as a traditional paper, but more easy language that can make a higher impact and speak to a broader audience and support policy change. So I was wondering, and I would like to hear your thoughts on how to balance the science and scientific part of it and the message and opinion or the interpretation of science a bit more freedom that I guess the commentary paper gives you instead of this the normal paper, the traditional format. And the other thing I would like to hear your thoughts on is how to choose where to publish it and the right partners to put on board. I don't think all of us here have a contacts with reporters or journal people. So I'm wondering if you have some advice on that, where to publish and how to choose the right partners to do it. And the first one, just to remind you, how to balance the science part of it and the opinion of the commentary, please. Thank you so much.
And is this something you're like trying to write for a general audience, for a non-scientific, like a non-academic audience?
Yeah, but I was wondering to publish it in a scientific magazine and then expand the sharing of it to a broader audience. And even the language, I think it's easier for a policymaker or for a ONG or for someone to understand the main messages and incorporate it in their daily lives. I don't know if I'm right and if you have some thoughts on that as well.
Can you tell me what kind of a scientific are you thinking, like a popular magazine or more kind of one of the magazines published by a journal?
Yeah, I didn't choose it yet.
Okay.
Yeah, but I hear some echo. Sorry. No, yeah, I didn't choose the magazine yet, but I was thinking a higher impact magazine because it has a better outreach, reach more people. I think more people read it. So I don't know if you have any other ideas on that as well.
Well, I do have ideas. So I think to the question of balancing like the science and the opinion, I think an important question to ask yourself is, what kind of identity do you want to establish for yourself in kind of your written work? And that's something that I've asked myself as well. Like, what is my role and what is my position? And so like I'm a professor at a public health school. So what does that mean to me? Well, I want people to take me seriously. I want people to, like, when they hear me talk on, write on a scientific topic, I don't want them to be like, okay, who's this guy? Is he biased? I want people to be like, this guy knows what he's talking about. I'm going to trust that this is a serious and scientific individual and that they're going to, give me a balanced take on the research. And I think what I can do is like offer my interpretation of that as someone that's thought, had the opportunity to think about whatever issues I'm talking about, probably more than the average person, because that's a lot of what we do is, critically engage with theory and methods and knowledge generation and critiquing like to what extent is this knowledge something that we think should be used in policymaking. Like, when it comes to the example of oil and gas in California, in the US, or in general, I can speak on the research that I do and that my colleagues do and say, like, this is what the scientific field, this is what we're finding. It's summarize all the science, and then that's pretty straightforward. We know how to do that if we're going through graduate programs. Then I like to kind of challenge some of the norms, or like maybe the typical ways of thinking. And for me, the typical way of thinking that I don't necessarily think is serving us is around, there's like the bigger picture questions, like the societal level questions, and then kind of the smaller questions that we might be trying to get at. So if I have an opinion on something, I might say, like, look, there's enough scientific evidence here to regulate oil wells. And that's, I think, a fair thing for me to say, like, and that's an opinion, but it's an informed one. And I've already laid the case out for, like, why I think that this is a good opinion, why this is something that I think should be sensible. Like, hey, let's look at all the evidence. There are some inconsistencies, but there's enough of a consistency here that we think that there's enough evidence to regulate. And it's not just me. I can point to others, this panel of experts that the state of California hired to review the evidence, issued a report and issued recommendations based on their review of the literature. I can report that as well and say, like, and I think that adds power. I think power from, scientific argument comes from, here's my view of the literature and here's what other people are saying. And I can filter that for you because I'm taking the time to get these conversations that are happening in these academic journals or academic spaces and be like, we really need to not just talk about this among ourselves. And then challenge the status quo way of thinking. So the status quo way of thinking is innocent until proven guilty, harmless until proven harmful. And what we end up doing is counting deaths and morbidities that have already happened because of our, regulatory failures at all the different levels. I don't think it was ever reasonable to assume that oil wells were safe, but we do. And we continue to drill and operate them. That's an absurd assumption in the first place. And I do want to say that because that points to a bigger systemic problem. So there's the immediate problem, like we have this world where oil wells are in neighborhoods. We have a system that we need to work within, unfortunately, right now in the short term to solve this problem. In the bigger picture, if we want to get at not just this issue, but other issues, let's challenge those like ways of thinking. So those are both opinions, but to me, they're, it's supported by evidence and by logic and not just, not just me as, not just my thoughts on uninformed thoughts on a topic. The other thing, so getting at, the impact, where you publish, all that stuff. We live in a world, I get most of my articles via social media and like scientific articles. Like I see what other, faculty that I know or colleagues that I know are like sharing on social media, what they're emailing, what they're talking about, to some extent, email lists, like think about all the different ways you're getting papers. I'm not really looking at the impact factor of, the journals as much as, maybe we did back in the day. Because I think it's easier, we don't encounter papers the way that we used to. When you open up a journal and you look at what the journal's publishing, we're searching, we're sharing in social ways. I think that that's a different model than what it has been historically. So I think I try, and this is another, I guess this is an opinion, but an informed one. I think get the paper in a journal that you think is a good fit for your paper. And if it's high impact and you think that's going to bring you kind of more attention from the emails, that, I think the practical ways that it's getting out, their social media reach, their email listservs, who tends to like look at those journals first, great. And I think that there's some value in that. Like we published our commentary in EHP, Environmental Health Perspectives, which is one of the, considered a very respected journal in our field, because we wanted to reach a broad audience. We wanted people to take it seriously. But if they didn't take it, we had a list of other journals that we were going to send it to as well. So I think, we tend to like aim high, and I think that I think that when that serves a purpose, great. But I don't necessarily think that that's the only way that people are accessing our information. It's a bit of a hot take. I just don't think that we need to worry about that as much these days. Bhavna, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, and I see we have some hands up.
I tend to work on problems that there's no data on. And so when I started working on neighborhood oil drilling 10 years ago, there was no research in LA, like zero. And so I think seeding the field is like how I've kind of incrementally, now everyone, oil drilling in California is a huge topic, right? In LA, it's been legislated out of neighborhoods, and that's going to be a fight. So if you're on kind of the leading edge, the things that I do, so early on, when I started first thinking about, this is also true of beauty products. When I started thinking beauty products are super toxic, what are the ways in which we can talk about them? I first wrote with Black Women for Wellness this blog post, which still lives somewhere on the web. And then we thought, okay, let's kind of look at the evidence. And then we wrote a peer-reviewed paper on the environmental injustice of beauty. And this kind of has become really well cited because then a lot of people are thinking about beauty products. And it becomes, kind of the baseline for the next thing, which is this empirical study that we're now doing, the taking stock study that I first put in the chat. So I would say, depending on the evidence you have, will determine the outlet you publish in. So if you think you're just kind of starting to think about it, a blog post is a great idea. And then you can see what people say. You have some evidence, but it's not a ton. You have a hunch. And then, once you have a peer-reviewed paper or two on something, you could probably write a more robust, like, scientific article on, that could be like in a public-facing journal. I think, for example, Teen Vogue, I'm a big fan. They cover all sorts of cool things. Like writing for something in Teen Vogue, I know lots of colleagues who've done that. And it reaches kind of a different audience and you can tell a story. On oil drilling, like when I was starting to think about the topic, I didn't write as many peer-reviewed papers as I did book chapters. And book chapters give you a lot more space to sort of think about the problem in a way. And I know that a lot of scientists don't necessarily publish book chapters, but I like them for the fact that you can kind of tell a story. So this is a book chapter I wrote on oil drilling and environmental justice and sort of like the story of why EJ has played a role. So, I mean, I really think it depends on where you are in your story and what you want. Like if you want to expand on it, a book chapter or like a narrative, kind of science magazine story could work too. Like I think that might be like kind of like a book chapter, right? So, or a peer-reviewed article really requires like tight, heavily cited, tons of data. To get there, you kind of have to have built for a while. So I think it depends on where you are in your like thinking journey on a project.
Awesome. It looks like we have 2 more questions. Now 3. Maria, if you want to go, and then maybe we can try and answer these a little bit quickly so we can get to all of the questions.
Okay, thanks, Carly. My name is Maria. I'm a doctoral candidate at the George Washington University. My question is that I often work with the policy sector, and I do understand how important it is like to communicate our research like in a very impactful way. And I think the media does an amazing job just like showing how impactful these exposures might be. But like in terms of environmental justice, sometimes it really worries me how overwhelming some of these messages are for like individuals or the communities. So how can we translate our research? And I know both of you have a lot of experience working on with communities. Like how do we translate our research for the community and talk about this without it being like really overwhelming for them?
It's gonna be late. That's much.
Oh.
Carly, did you want to go through all the questions and then we answer all of them because of time, or should we go one at a time?
I think you can go one at a time. Well, actually, yeah, for time, Rob, you can go ahead. You're on mute, Rob.
I'm Rob McConnell from USC.
And I just wanted to add one more comment to Emily's question. And I think David, you said, well, it's hard to do both, be an academic and do a lot of sort of outward communication. To me, one of the features of a commentary that's really attractive is it is both. It doesn't have the same sort of impact as or it has a different impact from a blog post, but it's a scholarly piece. If it's a good idea, it can have tremendous impact. And if you're lucky, it can be good for your career. Tom Valente and I've done some work on tobacco regulatory science, and we had a graduate student a couple of years ago who had a they call it a perspective, not a commentary, but it's the same thing. It was published in the New England Journal, and it was a lot of work for about 3 weeks. So it didn't even detract that much from from her dissertation work, or from writing a paper that takes months and months and months to do. It can be done quite. So I don't know if you guys have thoughts about that, or these can have a lot of impact, and if they get a lot of citations, Emily was asking about tenure and promotion. I don't think taking time to do a commentary necessarily hurts your sort of traditional appointments and promotion process.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. And then we'll take the last question, and I'm typing them in the chat so that we can all remember what they were.
I think I might be the last question. Hi, my name is Genesis Sandoval. I'm a student, an agricultural science student at Pasadena City College, and I'm a baby researcher. So I'm currently organizing a field study around the Exide pollution in East LA. And I have so many questions for you guys, but I'll give you one. I'm trying to really grow the impact on the data that I collect. Primarily what I'm doing is that I'm testing the lead soil before and after I do certain amendments with phytoremediation seeds and mycoremediation. And I'm also replicating studies that are already being done in the area so I can further support studies that are already happening. And so I know that you've mentioned a lot of ways that you can do that from the perspective of a scientist. You try to get it like just through eyes of social media. You might make your own post. You might speak to people at city council meetings, for example. What are some ways to not make this look like amateur science, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I'm actually taking samples to labs to get tested, but I'm also going to be doing field data as well. And I just want to make the data go far.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So I have included the first two in the chat, and I'm typing the third now. If David and Bhavna, you kind of want to just take whichever one or ones you would like to speak to.
I could start and just say that I think environmental justice research has, there are ways. I think that results communication is super critical, and you have to think about how community residents uptake information. A lot of this is, in my experience, there's like a grass tops, like there's the leaders in a community, and then there's residents. And usually you have to test your messaging and work with crafting your messages with those leaders, community leaders. And that I think is, and then they typically then can better communicate that information to their members. So I think that you will never know if that message works sitting alone in your office. You have to try it out and ask, does this make sense? What else would you like to know? How else would you, and then the community helps you craft it. So I would say that in EJ research, that's really critical, is working with the community. I think this is also true of the Exide case. I work on Exide. We work really closely with East Yards Communities for Environmental Justice with USC. And that I think there's a lot of researchers who have kind of come into the neighborhood, and the community is not super excited about some of the data that may be floating around. And sometimes they're interested. So I think making really real community connections and talking to the leaders who have been fighting Exide for the last 15 years, 30 years is really one of the only ways in which you can move that work. And then I think, to Rob's point, I think you can. I think being really critical about how you spend your time, you can spend. I think prioritizing this is a good way to think about your time actually expanding your impact. So spending a lot of time on a commentary, I don't think takes away from your peer-reviewed work. And actually people won't read your peer-reviewed work because they now know it exists, right? So I think a lot of peer-reviewed research gets buried and just dies on the vine because no one reads it, and it could be a super important study. And so I think it's actually a really helpful thing to spend time on, and then thinking about how you choose that, and which maybe you write 5 things and you only do it for 3 or something. Like maybe that's you be strategic. And I'll let David finish us up.
So
Thank you, Dr. Bhavna.
yeah, I agree with everything just said. And I think in addition, if we want to think about communicating, with communities, there's entire fields of study for like education, public health education and outreach. And there's frameworks that we can and probably should be reading. And I think that kind of goes towards encouraging an interdisciplinary way of thinking. Not that we need to be, not that the research is sufficient by itself, because community work it's praxis. It's like putting theory into practice, and there's a lot more to it than just knowing the literature. But it can help because there's a literature on environmental health literacy. There's literature, behavioral health, behavioral protective models, things like that we can and should be aware of, and then that can inform our engagement with communities. I think I've done less direct community engagement work than Bhavna and other people on this call, but I think just communities know what they're going through a lot of the times. I think that we need to remember that these, we don't need to protect people from things that they're experiencing. We are providing a framework, a systematic way of thinking about things that they're experiencing and probably know better than we do. So we have a different perspective on it, maybe more of a systemic, organized way of thinking about things with, numbers, but people are living these things. So I think it's important to honor that and respect that, of course, that we can trust that people can handle hard information. Commentaries, it sounds like we're all in agreement that they're worth writing and worth the time. And sometimes they're peer reviewed, sometimes they're not, but it's all good. And then showing the robustness, so to Genesis's question, I think, getting stuff out there, to me, I think about this, as we were talking to earlier, to me, it's about timing. When are you ready to share your data? As a scientist, I think that means that you've had the time to look at everything. You're not, you can look at things in real time, present stuff in real time. That can be a very democratic way to do things. But if what your goal is to like systematically look at a question and provide some sort of scientific answer to it, that takes time. And I think it behooves you to take the time necessary to gather the data, think about it critically, analyze it, interpret it, situate it, and then share it. And at that point, it's going to be robust. It's going to look robust because it is robust. So if you're getting to that point where you've done the analysis, you've done your thinking, you're ready to share it, I think that'll be clear. The venue, I wouldn't sweat it too much. People are going to disrespect social media. It's going to happen. But guess what? That's where people are. So you meet the people where they're at. But you can come with that robustness, and then having a peer review paper or even a preprint that you can point to can be really helpful. I think not just for legitimacy, but also saying like, if you care about this and you want to learn more, here's more. So that's how if you feel free to reach out if you want to talk more specifically about that, I'd be happy to chat with you some more. But it sounds like you're doing some really good work, so keep it up. And thank again for the opportunity to speak with you all today.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Carly, too, for organizing.
Absolutely, yes. And I just, want to reiterate, this was a joint session with the ISHE Research to Fellow program, as well as the USC Children's Center Be Heard seminar. So thank you so much, David and Bhavna, I think we could keep going for a while, but we really, really appreciate your time and your insight here. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And I hope everyone has a great weekend and happy holidays.